Hi everyone, really happy to be on this live today. I haven't done one for a little while, so I'm just gonna wait a second, and if you guys in the comments could let me know if you can hear sound okay and can see me okay, that would be great. If no comments come in, no problem. I'll assume everything's okay, but hopefully you can all hear me, no problem, all good, and then we can get started. So we got quite a few questions coming already, and there seems to be like a common denominator in some of them. So we've got Jaskaran asking a lot of questions about power and how it links to hypertrophy. So question is it possible to get hypertrophy in legs similar to the gym with small equipment like dumbbells and resistance bands at home? I think it's definitely possible to get hypertrophy without being in a traditional gym environment. However, I think it's going to be suboptimal. It's not going to be as good as being in the gym, just because we need to have reasonably heavy loads most of the time, unless we're using really specialized methods to get hypertrophy. And we need to get a progressive overload as well to that. And that's going to cause our body to induce hypertrophy. So it's going to give us that positive adaptation. And when you train at home, although it's kind of the new normal for a lot of people, there's only a limited amount of things you can do to make things harder. So say if you're doing squats or split squats at home and you've only got limited weight, you can use tempos, you can use blood flow restriction training, you can increase the amount of reps that you're doing. But beyond that, there's not that much you can do. Okay, you have to be really, really creative to get gains in that over a really long period of time. So it is possible to get hypertrophy in your lower body or upper body without being in the gym. However, in the long run, it's not going to be as successful as producing hypertrophy. So if you can get back in the gym, then I definitely would do as soon as you can. And with Jaskaran, so you mentioned hypertrophy and you asking if power training also helps trophy. I would say power training definitely will not help hypertrophy. You probably won't increase your muscle mass from doing power training. So power training being loaded jumps. I'm going to keep it very much on the power side because I don't want to touch on strength, which would be a little bit different. So if you're doing plyometrics, loaded jumps, anything like that, it's probably not going to give you enough of a stimulus because the load is not going to be high enough and the volume is not going to be high enough. So obviously if you do 6 box jumps for 3 sets, it's such a short amount of work that it's not going to cause any of the things that we need for muscle hypertrophy to occur. So power training isn't something that will help hypertrophy on its own. However, strength training, leading into your next question, strength training will help increase muscle mass. So with anything and with any adaptation we're trying to produce, so in this case, we're trying to build bigger muscles. If you look at the mechanisms behind how it's produced, we won't know exactly what does it. So if you go and you Google now mechanisms for hypertrophy or how to induce hypertrophy or something like that, you're going to get a number of different things. So we're going to have load, we're going to have volume, so the total amount of work done. We're going to have training to failure, so basically mechanical failure. We're going to have a bunch of different things. It's going to be a hormonal response that can feed into it as well. And then there's going to be a little line at the bottom, and it's going to say, we do not know the extent of which these different mechanisms induce hypertrophy. So we're not always 1,000% sure. We just know that if we tick 3 or 4 of the boxes that are there, we're going to get an increase in muscle mass. With strength training, we tick a lot of the boxes. So with strength training, we end up getting a decent amount of volume. So as long as you're not just doing 2 sets of 1 on bench press in the gym, you're going to get a good amount of volume. And even if you are doing really low volume training, if you're quite strong, if you've got 150 kg bench press, your warm-up sets are probably going to get you a decent amount of volume. So by doing strength training and not necessarily what we consider as hypertrophy training usually being considered as multiple sets of 8 reps or above, things like drop sets, rest pauses, things that induce a lot of fatigue, training all the way to failure, as many reps as possible. Without doing those things and just doing good quality strength training, including the assistance work around that. So obviously, say if you're doing an upper body strength session, it's unlikely you'll just bench press and leave. You might bench press, you might do chin-ups or pull-ups, you might do rows, you might do some assistance work for your arms. So although we might not traditionally think of some of these things as hypertrophy training, doing some of this strength training, even if it's 5 reps or below, is going to help us get some hypertrophy. So you don't necessarily have to do 20 reps in the gym. You don't have to go to failure. It can help at different times. But over time, strength training certainly contributes to increased muscle mass, as long as you're in a caloric surplus, as you mentioned. But ideally, you'll use some hypertrophy training as well, because doing strength and hypertrophy training is likely to be more successful in the short term and the long term than only doing strength training. So, Jessica, and I hope I answered some of your questions. There's another one, and it's on a similar path, so I might as well get through this. So sorry if I haven't got to your question if you've asked already. So this question is around an article we had around increasing muscle mass while maintaining strength and power. So maintenance is an interesting one because we talk about maintenance a lot, especially for a footballer during the season that doesn't have unlimited time to train, because you have team training, you have preparation for games and things like that. And sometimes after a game, you're fatigued for a few days. So we talk about maintenance a lot, and maintenance is actually quite easy. And it's easy when you have a good base in the first place. So a very strong athlete probably doesn't have to do too much to maintain their strength, because they've built it already. And as long as they have a stimulus every 1 to 2 weeks of something that's relatively heavy, they'll maintain their strength. However, if you can only squat 50 kg as an example, if you can squat 50 kg, then you probably have to do a larger amount of work to maintain that strength and increase it. Whereas if you can squat 150 kg, if you do a double or 2 sets of 2 or 3 sets of 2 at 130 kg, you're probably going to maintain your strength. So maintenance of strength is easy as long as you have a stimulus every week or 2, or maybe even 3, depending on your situation. Maintaining power is easy as long as you're not under fatigue. So if you're not tired and you manage to do some plyo work, some jumps and some sprints every week, you'll probably maintain your power, maybe not your speed as much. Maybe you need a bit more of a regular stimulus when it comes to speed. But for power, I think you can probably maintain that fairly easily as well. Now, in a lockdown situation, it's going to be much tougher to maintain strength, but probably just as easy to maintain power as long as you have space to jump or sprint. And even then, you can do static plyometrics, which will help maintain power. But maintaining strength is going to be much tougher because, like I mentioned before, you're not going to have as much of a stimulus. So if we think about training strength, we need heavy loads. And if we think about maintaining strength, we need heavy loads also. So how can you get that stimulus whilst in a lockdown situation? One of the simplest ways, and people have been utilizing it quite a lot, is isometrics. So an isometric in this context would be pushing maximally as hard as you can against an immovable object. And if you do that, you'll produce a large amount of force, and potentially more force than you would have actually produced in a dynamic movement, even if it's a heavy strength movement like a squat or whatever it might be. And the ways you can do this in a home setting is you can use a towel, as long as it's not an old towel. You can stand on it, you can hold it in your hands, and you can, in a quarter squat position, you can push as hard as you can. And you can do that single leg as well. Depending on how strong you are and how strong the towel is, single leg's probably going to be more appropriate for you. Also, in terms of the upper body, you can use a towel. You can hold it in both hands, and the towel could go around your back, and you could push into the ground as hard as you can. So you can get, they're just 2 examples, but you can get both an upper body and lower body isometric stimulus using only a towel. And there's been a lot out there on that, and you might have seen it on social media and some different athletes doing it. In an ideal situation, you would usually use some specially made straps for that situation, or you might use an immovable object you could do like a quarter squat with a single leg into a rack, so the racks are movable. So there's a few simple ways you can maintain strength. You just have to be a bit more creative with it, and you're going to be able to use isometric strength methods to maintain strength at home. So it's a little bit tough, and it's not exactly what we're used to, but it's a little bit, you need to be creative. Let's put it that way. Okay, so we got a question coming in from Martin about conflicting opinions around young players under 10s needing to stretch before matches, and what do we think about it? So just in terms of static stretching, and I think cooldowns can be thrown in there as well. There was a meta-analysis done, which is basically a study of studies. So someone collected all the studies that have been done on post-game stretching and the impact it has, whether it helps recovery, whether it reduces injuries. And what they found was that static stretching didn't reduce the risk of injury. And sometimes, if done for longer periods, longer than 60 seconds, could reduce an athlete's power output, which that's obviously not a good thing. However, in some situations, for a senior athlete, static stretching before a game, as long as it's a few hours before and isn't held for a really long period of time, it probably is appropriate because they might have traveled a long way to get there. They might have really tight hips or whatever it may be that's caused by sitting in a car. And static stretching might actually be appropriate in that situation. In your situation for under 10s, I wouldn't do any static stretching before games just because I think you can get more bang for your buck in terms of a warm-up. So by using dynamic movements like lunges, bear crawls, squats, and anything similar to that, which you see in dynamic warm-ups all over the place, is probably going to be useful enough to get under 10s ready. You're going to be mobilizing the joints, you're going to be activating appropriate muscle groups, and you're going to be raising the body temperature while doing that. Whereas if you just do static stretching, you might be lengthening a muscle in the short term, but you're probably not activating the muscle so it's actually ready to perform. You're probably mobilizing the joint a little bit, depending what muscle you're using, and you're probably not going to be raising body temperature. So I don't think if you stretch before a game with under 10s, they're going to lose every game. I don't think it's going to be that much of a huge change or be that much of an impact on the outcome. But I think you can spend your time better than doing static stretching. And I would say the same thing for post-game stretching as well. With an older group of players, if they like stretching, if it's just a convenient time point for you to give them some stretching post-game, because it might be a good time for the coaches to talk to each other and work out what the message they want to give the team is, whether it's gives the team a little bit of time to relax after a game. So they're a little bit less stressed, or the message you're going to give them might not be positive, or maybe it is positive and you just want emotions to cool down a little bit, then stretching can be a good thing to do if you have an appropriate space. But I wouldn't do that for longer than 5 or 10 minutes. I think in terms of recovery, I would think about nutrition, hydration, and sleep a little bit higher up in the hierarchy rather than stretching. But if it's just a good time for you to teach players how to stretch, or just like I mentioned, maybe from the social aspect or psychological aspect, there's a reason why you'd want them to relax a little bit before speaking to them, then I think it's probably a good idea. So yeah, not necessarily bad, but I think probably unnecessary. Okay, so Rizzle's got a question about training agility and being faster in straight line sprints, as well as gaining muscle at the same time. And we get asked this type of question a lot, and getting heavier through hypertrophy does not necessarily make you slow. If you just went into the gym and you did bodybuilding style workouts, no power work, no strength work at all, and you didn't get outside, you didn't sprint, you didn't change direction, you didn't play football, then you'd probably get slower. However, realistically, the amount of weight you're going to put on through hypertrophy, unless you are a very gifted athlete who naturally puts on muscle easily, it's not going to be enough weight to slow you down considerably. And it would only slow you down if you weren't doing any speed or pitch-based work. So a lot of footballers, especially under the age of 21, need to increase their muscle mass. It's really important, and it really can help bridge the gap between youth football and academy football and senior pro football. For some people, it can literally be make or break, just because the way smaller players are perceived sometimes, and the way that smaller players sometimes may not be strong enough or may not be big enough or heavy enough to deal with contact with other players, hold players off the ball, or win physical duels like tackles. it can be make or break. And if the worry is that you're going to slow down, it's probably not a worry that's valid. I really wouldn't worry about losing speed. The only thing I would worry about is being really sore all the time, but that would be more of an issue with your planning as opposed to any issues with training or training for muscle hypertrophy. If you're going out and you have a really important training session or a really important game and you do 10 sets of 10 on squat and bench press, then you're going to be sore and tired in the game. And that's just bad planning rather than hypertrophy training being badly. So being bad. So if you plan your week well and you find out when the appropriate times to do things like hypertrophy training or heavy strength training at a time point where you're recovered from the previous game and you have time to recover after that session for the next game, then you can pretty much do whatever you like as long as the load in and the volume's appropriate. So I think planning is more important than worrying about whether a different type of training is gonna make you slow or make you less agile. Let's just see what other questions are coming in. I know I've missed one or two, so I just want to go back. Okay, so this is the question I was looking for. So it took me a second to get there. So how to figure out if you've got muscle imbalances, which could be causing hip or knee problems. So muscle imbalances can exist from left to right side, and it can also be anterior and posterior, so front to back as well. And there's a few different things that you can do, and it's tough to say straight away if I don't know exactly what you're talking about. But usually we do have stability and muscle imbalances between left and right legs, depending which your dominant leg is. So if your dominant foot is your right foot, stand on your left leg and balance for a second, and it's probably going to be much better than the balance on your right foot, which is your dominant foot. And that's probably just you spend more time planted on your left foot when you're kicking the ball with your right foot, and that compounds over thousands and thousands of times that you've done that. So you probably are going to have imbalances from left to right, and possibly you're going to have imbalances between different muscle groups based on the training you've done or just what your anatomy is like as well. So if you're worried about a muscle imbalance, always check left to right and find a movement where you can check front to back as well, depending on what's going on. So something that you could do is just a leg extension and hamstring curls. And if you feel really strong on leg extensions and really weak in hamstring curls, you probably need to develop your hamstrings further. Also, if you do something like a glute bridge with your feet close to you and you feel it in your hamstrings a lot, then maybe your glutes are not as strong as they need to be. There's a lot of different ways to work out muscle imbalances, but without knowing exactly what you're referring to and what the imbalance might be, it's tough to say. But I would just test left to right, front to back, around the joint of what you're talking about, both above and below the joint as well, and then go from there. Okay, so another one from Akib. I like this question. So how to be in shape with lower body injuries. I just want to touch on why you would want to stay in shape. So when any player is injured with any injury, what you want to try and do is keep that player, and if it's yourself, for yourself, you want to stay as close to match fitness as possible. And even if we simplify it to literally hours of training, if you're used to playing 8 hours of football a week and then you can't play any football, it's going to be very tough to build yourself back to being with 8 hours. And obviously we can do that. We can work out distances that a player might run in a week and speeds they might run in a week and the amount of changes of direction and acceleration and deceleration. So it can get quite complicated and quite detailed. But conceptually, what we need to just think about and understand is how do we stay as close to match fitness as possible? So if your lower body is injured, I would think about what side is injured, because we have a lot of options. So in the gym, you can pretty much do anything you can normally do without one leg. You can just change all exercise to be single leg. You can get that leg out the way, and then you can maintain your gym program as close to normal as possible. So that's the first thing that I always do, just slightly adapt the gym program and keep going. The next thing would be to train as much as possible. So if it is a lower body injury, you might not be able to do that as much. If you can do slow jogging, I would do as much slow jogging as possible relative to the amount of training you've been doing. I would play as much as possible. So potentially, if you've had a minor ankle sprain, you might be able to play without being in intense game situations and without contact from other players. So training, I would still try to be doing as much as possible before going and doing that jogging that we mentioned. And then there are other creative ways that you can stay fit. So if you've used an assault bike, it would be a bike that has two handles and you'll push it. It's quite old school, but it's quite popular in CrossFit at the moment. So you can do single leg or no leg assault bike using both arms. And that way you can just continue training your aerobic system. You can also row on a rower. And I think it was Gabriel Jesus. Sorry if I'm saying his name terribly. So I'm sure I saw him on a rower a few years ago, and that's where I stole the idea from. So even if a leg is broken and in a cast, you can take the foot of the leg that's broken off of the rower. You can use a foam roller underneath. So imagine this is the leg and the foam roller is here. So that way you can continue to row and the leg just moves up and down over the foam roller, which is a really smart setup. And you can also use a slide board, or recently there's been a lot of little sliders like Versa slides or any other brand. So you can just put your leg on a slider and it will slide up and down without actually doing any work. So even in a cast, you can do a rowing program. So you can stay in shape, or you can stay aerobically fit whilst injured. You can also do seated battle ropes, which is a really good idea. I know so many gyms have battle ropes, commercial gyms these days. So you can do as much work as possible to stay as match fit as possible. And then as soon as a physio clears you to do some more running based work, obviously just increase the load slightly as you go, increase the amounts of work as you go, and then it will help you to get back as quick as possible. So relatively simple. You've got a lot of options. You just need to make sure that you do as much as possible without making the injury worse or causing more pain. Okay, so on imbalances again, unilateral exercises absolutely will help imbalances, and potentially they transfer over to running based performance a little bit better than bilateral performance. However, that's something that's going to be debated for many, many years. Unilateral, so single leg exercises or single arm exercises, which we probably do a little bit less of, are really useful. Not only are they great for strength and stability, they help just make sure that you might be at a little bit less risk of injury by making sure your left and right side are of a similar strength and can produce similar power. So there's a lot of research around there that's usually done with single leg jumps. And what's been found is that having over a 15% discrepancy between left and right is likely to put you at more of a risk of injury. 15% is not like a magic number. It's just something that's been drawn in the sand as like a guide for coaches and a guide for researchers to use, because otherwise there'd be a lot of arguments about what a useful measure is to use when to class something as an imbalance. So you want to make sure that your left and your right side are within 15% of each other in terms of strength, in terms of power, using something like jump height if you can. And also you can balance, that's the simplest thing, just a single leg balance. So if you can do a single leg balance in a low athletic position with your eyes open for 30 seconds, try it with your eyes closed for 30 seconds and see how you go. And if you can do that with both legs, stability is probably a good thing. If you can do 60 kg split squats with good technique with left and right, that's probably going to be useful as well. So unilateral exercises are really important, and I would just have them in every program. It's not something that I even think about in terms of, okay, well, this program is going to have unilateral exercise, whether it's the main strength movement or an assistance exercise or a warm-up, there's always going to be unilateral exercises in a program. Okay, let's see what other questions we've got coming in. Okay, it's an interesting one. So what do I think of a ATG split squat and tibialis raises for helping performance in football? So ATG split squat, if I'm right, is just going to be a split squat where we're trying to increase our range of motion in our ankle, and tibialis raises are going to be to strengthen tibialis anterior. I would say that ankle mobility is really, really important for health. We're probably going to get less ankle and knee injuries and possibly hip injuries if we have good or sufficient ankle mobility. And that's going to be different for everyone, depending what your history is going to be like, what country you live in, the type of exercise you've done. And if you have that good ankle mobility, it probably gives you the ability to dorsiflex more and be explosive. So when you sprint, you'll generally see people's toes come up and their foot will slap the ground as they go. And if you don't have good ankle mobility, you might not be able to do that, or you might be a bit limited. So what I'm going to say is, for health and performance, having good ankle mobility is really important. These two exercises are examples of how you could increase ankle mobility and anterior tibialis strength. So the ability to pull the toe up is going to improve. If you do these two things, I wouldn't expect your sprint speed to go through the roof. Like anything, this is just a method or an exercise to try and achieve something. Ankle mobility is crucial. The way you get there and what's successful for different people or in different situations is going to be different. But ankle mobility 100% is crucial for both health and performance. Okay, so sticking on ankle strength and stability now. So what's a better exercise is heel and tiptoe walks or banded ankle work. So they're really used at different times. So banded ankle work are often used in really early stage rehab. So maybe if someone's not in a weight bearing situation, they might use banded ankle work to strengthen the muscles around the ankle. And things like heel and tiptoe walks I use in most warm-ups, and sometimes at the end of a session for injury prevention. So they're a little bit different, and I wouldn't say one is better. They're probably just used at different times. Generally, for me, I don't have healthy players most of the time do banded ankle work, just because most of the time the load is not sufficient. So if you think of when you're sprinting, you're going to have multiple times body weight going through your calf and ankle. So by doing like a banded plantar flexion, almost like a banded calf raise, it's probably not going to be enough load to make any sufficient difference. So usually I'll do loaded calf raises, and then I'll do lots of different exercises for dynamic balance, lots of single leg hops, single leg deadlifts. And then I would use things like heel and tiptoe walks during things like a warm up. So yeah, it's not necessarily what one's better, they're just used at different times. Really quick one, are fasted runs in any way beneficial for footballers? Fasted runs I don't believe will help at all for football and performance or health. Ask Sean about this one, but just thought I'd knock it out of the park really quickly and say that you need energy to train at a high level. So I would always want to be in a fed state for training. Okay, is it a good idea to do sprint training before a team training session? 100% absolutely yes. So this is something I always suggest to players, especially when they have scheduling issues or a tight schedule. You don't always have multiple times and access to a field and all the different things that dictate what we do on different days. So before a team training session is a perfect time to do sprint training. Sprint training generally is lower volume. It's not like you're going to be doing 10,000 meters of sprints, because they just wouldn't be sprints. So if you have access to a field and you need to do speed work, before a session is a fantastic time to do it. It means that you're probably going to perform better in the session as long as the volume is not too high. And it just really means that you're going to be primed. So when we think of a ramp warm-up, we have raise, activate, mobilize, and potentiate. So potentiate is just basically doing anything which is going to make anything we subsequently do after better. And that generally has to be really high speed or high power or high force, because otherwise it's not going to create a situation where we get any potentiation and everything else improves. So it's a great idea to do sprint training. Most warm-ups do include sprints at the end of it. But yeah, it's a good idea to do sprint training. to do sprint training before a team training session, because it's just an efficient time to do it rather than having an additional session. You wouldn't want to do any sprinting after a session because you're going to be fatigued, and therefore your sprints are probably not going to be maximal. And that might be okay for technique type work, but usually as footballers, I tend to like using 100% effort most of the time and a competitive environment. And if I need to do any coaching through trying to make a technical change, I'll do that through constraints or a way I set the drill up. So instead of me telling you to do something like I might do with a sprinter who's probably quite in tune with what's going on, we'll put you in a situation where to be successful, you have to do something well. And that helps you be competitive and have 100% effort, but still create a technical change and get the outcome that we want. So I can't really think of a better time to do sprint training than right before a team training session. So we're going to call it there, guys. I really enjoyed doing it. We haven't done one of these for a while. I hope I got through everyone's questions sufficiently. And if not, you can just let us know in the forum of the MatchFit squad. Let us know in there and I can get to you. But yeah, really enjoyed this, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. And I'll see you in 1 month's time. Cheers, guys.